She had been missing for 4 months. Then, in the early hours of March 25, 1987, Josefina Rivera reached a telephone booth in North Philadelphia and called the police. Her voice carried a story so extreme that the first officers who met her struggled to understand it. Rivera said she had escaped from a man who was still waiting nearby in a Cadillac. She said other women were locked inside his house. She said 2 women had already died. Within minutes, a routine night patrol was moving toward one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Philadelphia history. This is a true story involving kidnapping, sexual violence, and murder. The details are presented without graphic imagery and with respect for the victims and survivors. The house stood at 3520 North Marshall Street in a tight row of homes where front doors opened almost directly onto the sidewalk. From the outside, it did not look like a secret prison. Neighbors knew the owner as Gary Heidnik, a 43-year-old man who drove expensive cars, carried cash, and called himself a bishop. Heidnik had founded a small religious organization called the United Church of the Ministers of God. He had also worked as a nurse and had made a surprising amount of money through investments. These details created a public mask, a man who appeared eccentric, but independent and successful. Behind that mask was a long history of psychiatric treatment and previous criminal behavior. Years earlier, Heidnik had been imprisoned after holding a woman with an intellectual disability against her will. The warning signs had existed. Yet by late 1986 he was living freely in North Philadelphia, preparing the basement of his row house for a plan built on control. The contrast was part of what made the house so difficult to recognize as a place of danger. A stranger might notice the bars and heavy doors, but row houses often shared walls, noise, and little privacy. A television playing behind a closed door was ordinary. A man coming and going at unusual hours might attract attention without producing evidence. The prison did not exist in an abandoned building. It existed beneath daily life. On November 25, 1986, 25-year-old Josefina Rivera entered Heidnik's car. Rivera was a mother of 3 who was struggling with addiction and surviving through sex work. He took her to the Marshall Street house. Once inside, the situation changed. He assaulted her, restrained her, and forced her into the basement. Heidnik had dug a narrow pit into the concrete floor. It could be covered with a heavy board, turning a small underground space into a dark cell. Pipes along the basement walls became anchor points for chains. The television upstairs was often kept loud enough to conceal sound from below. Rivera understood something important almost immediately: strength alone would not open the locks. She would have to watch him, study him, and survive long enough to find a weakness. Just days later, another woman disappeared. Sandra Lindsay was 24. She knew Heidnik and had reportedly agreed to meet him, but she never returned home. Her family became worried and contacted police. Their concern did not stop what was happening inside the house. In December, Heidnik brought in Lisa Thomas, who was 19. In January came Deborah Dudley, 23, and Jacqueline Askins, 18. The women were isolated, restrained, deprived of food, and subjected to repeated abuse. Heidnik controlled when they could speak, sleep, or receive water. Resistance brought punishment. Silence offered no guarantee of safety. The basement was not large, but fear made it feel endless. The captives could hear footsteps above them and the turning of locks. They learned the sounds of the house: pipes, floorboards, the television, a car outside. Ordinary noises became signals. Every sound might mean food, violence, or another night in the pit. They were also forced to live with uncertainty about the outside world. Did anyone know where they were? Had families reported them missing? Would police take those reports seriously? Heidnik exploited that uncertainty. Isolation became another lock, one that could not be cut with a tool. Rivera began memorizing the rhythm of Heidnik's movements. She watched where he kept keys and how he checked restraints. She listened when he talked about his plans. She noticed when he wanted obedience, admiration, or help. Her survival strategy was dangerous. She tried to make him believe she was becoming cooperative. That did not mean she was free. It meant she was trying to create the smallest possible opening inside a system designed to remove every choice. During the winter, Sandra Lindsay became gravely ill. The women could see that she needed medical care. None came. Sandra died in the house in February 1987. She was 24 years old. Her death changed the basement. It proved that Heidnik was willing to let a captive die and then conceal the evidence. For the women still alive, hope became harder to protect. Rivera later described continuing to perform the role Heidnik expected, because any visible refusal could endanger everyone. Deborah Dudley resisted him fiercely. In March, Heidnik punished the women by placing them in the pit and using water and electrical current on their restraints. Deborah was killed. She was 23. The specific cruelty of these crimes has often dominated accounts of the case. But focusing only on the offender can erase the people trapped inside. Sandra Lindsay and Deborah Dudley were not details in a horror story. They were young women with families who searched for them and lives that should have continued. 4 women remained alive: Josefina Rivera, Lisa Thomas, Jacqueline Askins, and, soon, Agnes Adams. By this point, Rivera had spent nearly 4 months studying her captor. She knew that a failed escape could lead to immediate retaliation against the others. A locked basement door was only one obstacle. Heidnik also used threats, humiliation, and forced participation to make the women fear that the police would not believe them. Rivera continued to build his trust. She acted as if she accepted his plan. She made him think she could help him find another woman. Every conversation was a test. Too much eagerness could make him suspicious. Too little could close the only path upstairs. This kind of resistance can be almost invisible. It does not resemble a dramatic fight or a sudden break through a window. It requires a person to hide fear, control every expression, and sometimes say what a captor wants to hear. Rivera's performance had to continue through exhaustion and grief. She could not tell the others exactly when an opportunity might come, because she did not know herself. On March 24, Heidnik allowed Rivera to leave the basement with him. That night, they encountered 24-year-old Agnes Adams. Heidnik brought Agnes back to the house, making her the 6th woman taken captive. For Rivera, the moment was devastating. Another person was now in danger. But Heidnik's decision also showed that her strategy was working. He had begun to believe he could take Rivera outside without losing control. Rivera told him she could approach another woman, but only if she went alone. She argued that the woman would be frightened by a man waiting beside her. Heidnik finally agreed. He parked at a gas station near 6th Street and Girard Avenue while Rivera walked away. For the first time in months, there was no chain attached to her body. She kept moving until she was out of his view. Then she ran. Rivera first reached the home she shared with her boyfriend. She tried to explain where she had been and what was still happening inside the Marshall Street house. The story was almost impossible to process. She then went to a telephone booth and contacted police. Officers David Savage and John Cannon met Rivera near 6th and Oxford Streets. She described the Cadillac, the man waiting inside it, and the women chained in the basement. The officers followed her information and found the car exactly where she said it would be. They approached Heidnik and ordered him out. Rivera identified him. The officers detained him, but there was no time for relief. She insisted that women were still inside the house. The police traveled to North Marshall Street. Metal security doors and bars covered parts of the property. Inside, a television played loudly. Officers moved through the house toward the basement. Each minute mattered. Rivera had escaped, but the remaining captives could not know whether she had reached help or whether Heidnik would return angry. Police had to treat an unbelievable report as a real emergency. Rivera guided them through the uncertainty, supplying details that could be checked: the car, the address, the layout, and the number of women still alive. At the bottom of the stairs, they found Lisa Thomas, Jacqueline Askins, and Agnes Adams alive. The women were restrained near a mattress and a pipe. Firefighters were called to bring bolt cutters. After months in captivity, the locks were finally opened. The search of the property confirmed that Rivera's account was true. Investigators recovered evidence connected to the deaths of Sandra Lindsay and Deborah Dudley. Deborah's body was later found in a wooded area in New Jersey, where Heidnik had tried to hide it. The rescue created a media storm. Reporters crowded the block. Headlines described a house of horrors. But the sensational language could not explain how this had continued for 4 months in an ordinary neighborhood, or why the disappearance of vulnerable women had not produced a faster response. The case exposed a painful pattern in the way missing people can be judged. The women were poor, several had disabilities or addiction problems, and some survived through sex work. Those facts increased their vulnerability, they did not reduce the value of their lives. A disappearance should not become less urgent because the missing person lives outside the image of a so-called perfect victim. The surviving women were questioned while physically and emotionally exhausted. Their testimony would become central to the criminal case. They had to describe events that most people could barely imagine, while defense attorneys examined every difference in their memories. Heidnik's trial began in June 1988. His lawyers did not deny that he had imprisoned and abused the women. Instead, they argued that severe mental illness meant he could not be held legally responsible. Prosecutors argued that his preparation, concealment, threats, and efforts to destroy evidence showed that he understood his actions and knew they were wrong. The jury rejected the insanity defense. On July 1, 1988, Gary Heidnik was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 6 counts of kidnapping, 5 counts of rape, and multiple counts of aggravated assault. He received death sentences for the murders of Sandra Lindsay and Deborah Dudley. Years of legal proceedings followed. Heidnik repeatedly claimed he had been framed, even as the evidence and survivor testimony established what had occurred in his home. On July 6, 1999, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania executed him by lethal injection. He remains the most recent person executed by the state. An execution, however, is not the ending of a survivor's story. Josefina Rivera had to live with memories of captivity, public scrutiny, and questions from people who had never faced the impossible decisions of a hostage. Her methods of survival were sometimes misunderstood because survival under coercive control rarely looks simple from the outside. She did what she believed would keep her alive long enough to create an opportunity. When that opportunity arrived, she did not disappear. She called for help, identified Heidnik, and led police back to the house, knowing she would have to face him and describe everything. Because of that decision, Lisa Thomas, Jacqueline Askins, and Agnes Adams were found alive. Their rescue was not the end of their struggle. Survival meant medical treatment, police interviews, court appearances, and years of living with a story that strangers would repeatedly retell. Their names deserve to be connected not only to captivity, but to endurance. They entered the basement as 6 individuals, not as characters created for a criminal's legend. This case is often remembered for a basement, a pit, and the crimes of one man. It should also be remembered for the woman who learned his routines while pretending to surrender, for the families who kept asking questions, and for the survivors who testified. Sandra Lindsay and Deborah Dudley should be remembered by name, not only by the way they died. In the final hours of March 24, 1987, Gary Heidnik believed he had complete control. His locks were secure. His house was quiet. He had frightened his captives into believing that no one would come. But control depended on one false assumption, that Josefina Rivera had stopped looking for a way out. She had never stopped. And when she reached that telephone booth, the prison beneath North Marshall Street began to fall apart.